Before I start, if I can just say thank you to CTTR and the School of Humanities for giving me a mini sabbatical allowance in the last academic year that made this research possible. Before I go into the main topic of this afternoon, which is my ongoing work with Scanda Vale, I think it's important to share with colleagues my approach to the study of religion. I think this is important as we're an interdisciplinary bunch, and the study of religion comes with a very particular set of problems. The primary problem is that everyone already has an opinion on religion and an understanding or definition of religion. This often leads to fascinating lecture room discussions, but is methodologically problematical. As I always say to my first year students, not every person on the street or indeed within the academy, has an opinion on marine biology or accountancy methodology, but every bugger has an opinion on religion. What this means is that even well-informed and well-meaning interdisciplinary scholarship, people will use the term religion, but mean radically different things. So my approach is framed within a lived religion methodology. This approach makes several departures from the inherited frameworks of religious studies, which I argue are still enrobed in the theological trappings of previous generations of scholarship. Previously, academic approaches to religion sat within the world religions paradigm. This preferenced textual scholarship, historical and philosophical approaches to religions, and invariably gave voice to institutions, hierarchies, and leaderships. It often focused on beliefs and conceptions of God, hangovers from liberal theology. Predictably, this led to essentialized understandings of religion, which allowed religious communities and worldviews to be neatly packaged. Linked inextricably with the colonial process, the world religions paradigm gave rise to the isms of scholarship, the Hinduisms, Islams, Judaisms, Sikhisms of so many textbooks. Over the course of the last 200 years, these isms have been invariably dominated by several themes, including the dominance of male voices, scriptures, leadership figures, and crucially, abstracted beliefs, which led to essentialized versions of Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, or whatever group we may care to mention. The lived religion paradigm is different. It preferences people, not texts, practices, not beliefs, and looks at everyday religious acts of everyday people, rather than essentialized frameworks which tell us what all Muslims should believe or how all Christians should act. Instead of studying religions from the top down, it studies them from the bottom up. In short, we're trying to correct the error of the first missionary and interfaith practitioners who traveled the world with a Western Christian view of religion, asking other communities, "What do you believe?" whilst trying to cram diverse human understandings of religion into their theological shaped box, which focused on texts and conceptions of orthodoxy. How much better our inheritance of religious studies would have been had they asked the question, "What do you do?" Because when we look at what people do, we encounter lived religion, everyday acts that give meanings to the lives of everyday people. And when we observe such acts, the thing we notice is that religious identity is not neat and tidy, but messy and complicated. That lay people invariably disagree with religious leaders. That groups of Buddhists, Christians or Muslims in one part of the world so often bear almost no relation to their counterparts in other parts of the world. We see that religion as lived is a dynamic and evolving phenomenon where change is normal. So when I speak of religion, I always mean this lived and dynamic definition, as opposed to the static theological definitions of the past. In the hope that it helps, here is my own definition of religion. Far from perfect, I'm sure, but honed over 25 years of thought. Religion is the intergenerational renegotiation of etiquette for everyday living between human and other than human persons. Now, colleagues from religious studies will see my dependence on the work of Graham Harvey here, which I happily acknowledge. But I introduce what I hope is a key addition to Harvey's definition, the intergenerational renegotiation, as this helps us to focus upon religion as a dynamic, relational phenomenon that is radically diverse in different centuries, locations, and cultures. This understanding of lived religion is particularly relevant to my current research and the topic of this seminar, as it builds upon my previous work with Lynn Schofield and George Crusadis in particular, but also my work on Hindu identity with Vivekananda. In particular, the issue of multi-faith identity comes to the fore, and this brings into focus again conversations upon categories such as Hindu or Christian in the private practice and public projection of religious communities with whom we research. Scholars love to put people in boxes. It makes them neat, constrained, and understandable. I want to argue today that we need more nuance than this to understand the lived reality of religious communities and actors, and my case study is Scandar Vale. Scandar Vale, or more properly, the Community of the Many Names of God, is a monastic community of around 25 monks, nuns and lay people situated in Llanpimsan, Carmarthenshire, in rural West Wales. It is a large site, taking in the land and buildings of 3 original farms, and operates 3 temples, 2 charity shops, one on site and one in a nearby town, a simple hostel for pilgrims, and a fully equipped end-of-life care hospice in a nearby village. They also pass on over 100 tons of food gifts from pilgrims to aid agencies each year. They attract around 90,000 pilgrims a year from around the world, although the overwhelming majority are British pilgrims of South Asian descent, around 90% of which are Sri Lankan heritage and around 10% of which are Gujarati heritage. The monks, nuns and lay people are overwhelmingly white British or white European, with only 2 members of South Asian heritage. Scandar Vale was founded by Guru Sri Subramaniam, born Percival de Silva in 1929, into a very privileged Sri Lankan family, with personal links to the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka through his mother's side. Many hagiographies, or what our friend and colleague Steve Jacobs has referred to as guruographies, include tales of prodigious childhoods, and Subramaniam is no different. The product of a compassionate Hindu mother and an austere Christian father, childhood tales of Percy include his performance of full-scale pujas or ceremonies before the age of 9, and claims to have played in the nearby woods with his best friend, the incarnate spirit of St. Francis of Assisi. De Silva left Sri Lanka at the age of 18 and travelled through Europe, settling in London 2 years later. During his time in London, he worked as a children's entertainer, a pot washer, and a flower seller. It was while selling flowers that he gathered together a group of spiritually inquisitive Westerners who had come to his home for meditation and philosophy classes. This group included a local Methodist minister, continuing the relationship between Hindu and Christian worldviews in the Guru's philosophy. The 1970s saw a huge change in Subramaniam's life. In a vision, he saw a field that he believed was a message to build an ashram upon the site. Actively scouring newspapers and auction listings, he found the sales particular of a small farm in Carmarthenshire, visited and confirmed it was the site. After purchase, which was arranged via the sale of his lease on his London flat and further contributions from devotees, the embryonic Scandar Vale was born. With one dilapidated farmhouse, with no running water, no intact roof, no electricity and no phone line, and which housed itinerant sheep upon their arrival, the Guru and his initial band of devotees set about building the community brick by brick with their own labour and skills. Indeed, it's only in the last few years that any work undertaken at Scandar Vale has used outside contractors. For the first 40 years, all of the temples and infrastructure that you see in the pictures were built solely by community members in appallingly harsh living and working conditions. Over the years, 2 more neighbouring farms and a forested piece of mountainside were purchased through gifts from devotees, leading to the site we have today. The Guru died in 2007, having instituted a Swami's Council prior to his death to run the day-to-day activities of the ashram. Scandar Vale is really a nickname for the community, based upon the name of Shiva's firstborn son, also called Subramaniam. The formal name of the community is the Community of the Many Names of God, and that nomenclature is very important, as the self-identity is one that rejects the label Hindu. Both in archival sermons and in recent conversations, members consistently reject the term Hindu to describe their religion. This may seem strange at first, as there are 3 demonstrably Hindu temples on site, dedicated to Murugan, a form of Subramaniam, Ranganatha, a form of Vishnu, and Kali, a form of Shakti or feminine divine power. At these temples, puja or Hindu worship is undertaken with a mixture of English and Sanskrit, often in the form of mantras or bhajans, holy songs. Members believe in reincarnation, openly talking about past lives, not just of themselves but of their pets, and a Hindu calendar of religious festivals is closely followed. Around 95% of their pilgrims are British Hindus. And yet the self-identity of Scandervale is of a multi-faith community. They wear Christian robes and take Franciscan vows of monasticism. They celebrate Christmas and Easter and St. Francis's feast day, and every Sunday there is a Christian service, including a Eucharist. Mantras are sung to the Buddha and Jesus, and there are depictions of Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Zoroastrian and Sikh iconography in the 2 larger temples. In the smaller Mother Goddess temple dedicated to Kali, there is a statue of Mary, Mother of Jesus. The overwhelming majority of community members grew up in Christian or Jewish families, and for 2 of the Swamis in particular, their relationship with Jesus is of particular importance to their understanding of the divine, even when conducting what ostensibly appear to be traditional Hindu ceremonies. These beliefs and links to the divine are articulated in 2 particular ways at Scandervale, again, both linked to traditional Hindu worldviews. The first of these is Bhakti Yoga, and the second is Karma Yoga. Bhakti, which is often translated inadequately as devotion, really means more than that. It comes from the Sanskrit root bhaj and means to be mixed up in. It's the same root word as the more familiar word we use with onion bhaji in our beloved takeaways. I think that helps to convey a meaning greater than devotion, an understanding of the divine, which means that through worship, and particularly attendance at temple pujas, one can literally become mixed up in or a part of the divine through loving devotion. Karma comes from the Sanskrit word kri and means action, although it's often translated as work. In its simplest understanding, Karma Yoga is believed to be a route to enlightenment through selfless service. At Scandervale, that comes in the form of seva, which can be understood as charitable action. Here, one of Scandervale's unique features is highlighted, which is their focus of Karma Yoga upon not just humanity, but also the animal kingdom. Scandervale is a veritable menagerie of life. Having hundreds of acres of farmland, they have become a haven for animal life due to their simple but absolute conviction that animal life is as sacred as human life. This has meant that over the years, they have acquired many animals that would have otherwise been slaughtered by local farmers, have rescued many birds from local markets that were destined for the table, and have an entire herd of deer which bred from a couple of animals that found their way onto the ashram from local fields. In addition to the deer, they have hundreds of geese, chickens, ducks, cows, donkeys, water buffaloes, dogs and cats. Most famously, they have 2 elephants, Vali and Lakshmi. Vali was a gift from the Sri Lankan government after she was orphaned as a baby and has lived at Scandervale for almost 40 years, fulfilling official duties as a temple elephant and giving blessings in her younger days. Lakshmi is a recent arrival, fostered from a French circus, and has complex health needs. She's gone to Scandervale to ensure a comfortable and peaceful end of her life. Perhaps the most noteworthy and newsworthy animal to live and die at Scandervale was, however, Shambho, a temple bull that was the heart of a controversy in 2007 that made front-page news around the world. The Shambho controversy is a complex and long story, so I'll only outline it here. It is important, though, as it directly relates to the projected identity of the community. In short, however, one of the cattle cared for at Scandervale tested positive for bovine tuberculosis in 2007. Under Welsh government rules, the animal had to be destroyed so as not to contaminate others, including potentially contaminating others on nearby farms. Scandervale were, rather obviously, appalled as this countered their view of the sanctity of all life, and then argued to the authorities that Shambo was a temple animal, not part of the food chain, and that he had no contact at all with commercial livestock. Whilst these arguments received some sympathy, the legal position was clear. The law allowed for no exceptions at all. Consequently, the authorities announced that Shambo had to be given up. What happened next was little short of extraordinary. Pilgrims flocked to Scandervale, not just from the UK, but from around the world. Hundreds of people formed a human shield around the temple where Shambo had been moved to, in direct defiance of the government orders. In the end, the authorities carried out their removal and destruction of Shambo, with rather sheepish-looking police officers picking up and carrying away many members of the community who remained peaceful in their protests to the end. The event was seismic in the history of Scandervale. Although it was 13 years ago, the emotions are still very raw. In conversations earlier this year, Swami still got visibly emotional when reflecting on the story. The event also had a wider effect on British religious life. For one of very few occasions, a religious minority had dominated headlines and had been largely sided with by the British public. 3 years before religion would become a protected characteristic under the 2010 Equalities Act, Scandervale found itself at the heart of the battle between secular laws and minority religious worldviews. So to turn to scholarship on Scandervale, there's precious little to date. Jeeves and Warrior have written the only substantial articles, and Nott and Parsons have mentioned the community in wider chapters on Hinduism in Britain. Indeed, so scarce is scholarship on Scandervale that articles from anthropologists and animal behaviouralists on the elephants far outnumber articles looking at the religious life of the community. But in the scholarship we do have, academics have invariably labelled the community as Hindu, in direct opposition to the self-identity of the community at Scandervale. In Jeeves's work, he explores how the religious rites and ceremonies at Scandervale fall outside orthodox, that's always in inverted commas, forms of Hinduism and Shaivism in particular. He is, of course, absolutely correct that they are considered unorthodox by many Hindus, who cannot accept a non-Brahmin, Western white priest conducting the ceremonies. And yet, as Jeeves further notes, tens of thousands of British Hindu pilgrims a year either turn a blind eye or are genuinely unbothered by the background of the person conducting the ceremony. For them, the opportunity of darshan, or a view of divinity within the temple, is all that matters. In Warrior's work, an article on the Shambo controversy, she clearly locates the community as having projected a Hindu identity for the duration of the crisis. Whilst many local devotees will have engaged with the protests due to their views on the sanctity of life and their relationship with the community, it was Hindus who flew in from around the world, and Hindu politicians who offered sanctuary to Shambo in their countries. Indeed, when describing Shambo to the press, the Swamis always referred to him as a temple animal, and he was even physically moved to the confines of the Murugan temple as a temporary sanctuary during the standoff. Warrior helpfully notes that this alignment with a Hindu identity may well be temporary, and that further identities may well be moulded by what she describes as non-Hindu members of the community, who are now making decisions after the death of the Hindu founding guru, again her words. I'm going to return to this point in my concluding remarks. So I want to just say a little bit about my relationship with Scandervale and my field visit. I've known the community since 1995, when I arrived as a student at nearby Lampeter. Upon my return to the University of Wales as a lecturer in 2006, I was a frequent visitor until 2013. During this period, I regularly brought students on study visits and took my young family to fetes and open days. I mention this as the length of my relationship has proven to be an important factor in gaining access. Scholarship on Scandervale is limited precisely because they are so circumspect about who they allow in. Indeed, during my time with them earlier this year, I found out that they, as a matter of course, turned down all requests from academics to study the group, which is on average about 10 a year every year. I mention this not to suggest that I somehow have a privileged position, but to remind us that fieldwork is always a negotiation, and getting access is often the hardest part. Indeed, so unusual was I that one devotee who had known Guru and had been visiting for over 30 years expressed huge surprise and happiness that I was there with the words, "Blimey, they must really trust you, so you're all right by me." Having not returned to Scandervale since leaving Wales again in 2013, I spent a lockdown-shortened fieldwork mini-sabbatical there in February and March of this year. In just a short 2-week period, which was supposed to be a month before COVID hit, I was able to reconnect with old faces and meet the many new faces that had arrived in my absence. During this time, I lived as a full member of the community. I rose at 4:30 a.m. each morning for puja in the Murugan temple and would go to at least 3 services a day, but more often 4 or 5, with the last at 9 p.m. In between, everyone living at Scandervale had to do at least 4 hours and usually much more of seva. This is very often gendered at Scandervale. I was invariably asked to perform physical tasks, and female devotees are often asked to polish brass or arrange flowers. After 10 days of clearing brambles, I was light-heartedly referred to as Swami Bramblananda by the other devotees and would have killed for the chance to polish brass in the warmth of the temple. But that would have been to miss the point. I was being tested by the community. Having placed their trust in me, they expected me to muck in, and I was happy to do so. However, an average day included 4.5 hours in temple services and 5 hours of physical labour. With meal times also set, and some temples a 20-minute walk in each direction from other parts of the site, grabbing moments for formal conversations was a challenge. But I learned huge amounts by deep hanging out, as Clifford Geertz so wonderfully described fieldwork. Thankfully, in my second week, I had more time to talk with members one-to-one, and the brothers and sisters arranged my work schedule to allow for this. I think that meant I'd passed the test. Access to the community was clearly controlled, especially with regard to physical space, where refectory areas and some worship spaces were separated for permanent members of the community, but all but one member of the community were opening and welcoming, and no subjects, including members leaving and minor scandals, were off topic. Indeed, as is often the case, people wanted to share their stories with someone interested in their life and worldview. At the end of my time, I had 54 pages of handwritten notes and had spent 58 hours sitting on the cold floor at temple services, in addition to a similar number of hours of physical labour. As I emerged from a life with no radio, newspapers, television, internet or phone reception, I encountered a world on the precipice of lockdown. So what did I find in my time at Scandervale? I looked at 2 main issues: how authority manifested after the death of the Guru, and how the multi-faith elements of life affected identity. As background to each of these, it is important to note that I found evidence for a continued belief in a Hindu cosmology. Scandervale has long associated with a worldview based on Advaita Vedanta, a monistic cosmology which teaches that there is only one reality and that difference is illusion. The whole point of the human condition is to realize our oneness with this reality and thus achieve liberation or moksha. Swamis still revert to this position when explicating their worldview. And yet there are also clear examples of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, or qualified non-dualism. In short, this position argues that we have a common essence, a spark of divinity, if you like, with ultimate reality. This approach allows for a more devotional form of religious practice. With monistic views of reality, it's often asked why one should worship if you're effectively only worshipping yourself. And this is highly relevant, as it's become normalized in many Hindu traditions, since the work of Vivekananda that I outlined in my recent book, to understand these different approaches as a stepped view of religion, which culminates in Advaita Vedanta, a form of hierarchical inclusivism. For many Hindus, this crosses religions and will enculturate practices and figures from different traditions, but only as lower forms of spirituality when compared to the highest truths of Advaita. I outline this because there is a clear hierarchical inclusivism at Skanda Vale, but not in this traditional way. The claims of the community members to a multi-faith identity must also be critiqued to understand it fully. Each of these related issues can be seen to play out in issues of authority and issues of identity within the movement. The traditional view of second-generation religious communities is one of institutionalized or concretized charisma, wherein a council, institution, or other body takes over decision-making and authority after the founder has died. I suggest that something subtly different can be seen to be happening at Skanda Vale, and that is linked to the view of the Guru himself. For community members, the Guru has not gone, he's just dead. In fact, he really hasn't gone. He's buried, intact, on a site in a special Mahasamdi shrine, not cremated like most Hindus. He is still a relatable person. He simply happens to be dead. Conversations are held with him as if he's in the room. Members who never met him talk of him as if they'd had personal meetings. Whilst the Swami Council could be seen as institutionalized charisma, their embodied theology is a continuation of relational authority with the Guru as an other than human person. The trajectory that he put in place for Skanda Vale is not an abstract instruction, but a continuation of a relatable, embodied authority. It is not the institution of a Hindu tradition or cosmology that the Swami Council is embodying, but the institution of a personality with a very unorthodox, syncretic worldview. This therefore means that Skanda Vale's relational religious identity, linked as it is with categories of multi-faith and Hindu, needs re-examining. Jeeves is clear to link Shaivism, and Warrior is clear to link Hindu. I don't disagree with their findings per se, I just think that they're asking the question at slightly the wrong angle. Whilst agreeing with Warrior in particular that they have used the category of Hindu when it's politically useful, despite rejecting the term again and again in conversations during fieldwork, identity and authority is not gained from this category. Indeed, there's a lovely bemusement given off by members when academics try to fit them into a box as specimens of study. What I'm suggesting is that we should not ask the question, what box do they fit in, but rather, from where do they take their authority? By shifting the question, I think we get a better understanding of the lived, performative understanding of their worldview. Members are not interested in the heritage of a particular school of philosophy, as outlined by the mix of a very strict form of Advaita theory with a clear preference for Vasishtadvaita practice, but instead ask, what would Guru do? Orthodoxy of belief is deferred to multipraxy of action, based on what I want to call autodoxy. It is the life and actions, the teachings and example of the founding Guru, which gives Skanda Vale an identity. He was not an ordained member of a movement such as the Ramakrishna Math, with an identity contingent upon agreed teachings and hierarchies of authority. He strode out to the West independently, with what sociologists of religion have referred to as a bricolage approach, sometimes denigrated with the term pick and mix spirituality, although for the record, that's what all religious people do. In so doing, he becomes the focal point of authority. His story is their story, and autodoxy replaces orthodoxy. This has a direct knock-on to Skanda Vale's form of hierarchical inclusivism and relationship to conceptions of Hinduness. Skanda Vale's hierarchical inclusivism is quite different to Vivekananda's. Whereas Vivekananda totally reinterpreted his own guru, changing him from an ecstatic bhakti devotee to a sage Advaita philosopher, and whereas Vivekananda had a hierarchical inclusivist framework that was clearly Advaitic, Skanda Vale has a hierarchical inclusive framework that is orthodoxical. This means there is fuzziness between their Advaita and Vishishtadvaita practices and worldviews. But that simply doesn't matter to the members of Skanda Vale. Perhaps in an example of Festinger's cognitive dissonance, this seeming contradiction is perfectly acceptable as it is following the Guru's example. It does not need to revert to a wider cultural framework. For the members of Skanda Vale, even for those that did not meet him during his life, their Guruji provided a direct experiential link to the divine, so his example is all that is needed. So although Warrior and Jeeves are correct that Skanda Vale position themselves within a Hindu worldview when it is expedient so to do, that is different to defining the movement as Hindu per se. Back in the 1980s, our esteemed colleague Eileen Barker, now Professor Emeritus at LSE, produced her great work, The Making of a Muni. Based on close ethnographic work with converts to the Unification Church, Barker simplified the questions we ask of religious communities in the face of a barrage of criticism from the anti-cultic movement against anyone who studied minority or new religions. Barker's great contribution was not to walk into the community with a framework into which to fit the group, but to walk in and observe what people actually did. This simple, subversive act brought the theory of Malinowski into practice. In the same way, I argue that we must define religion as we find it, not how we expect to find it. The community at Skanda Vale may well fit some aspects of a Hindu framework of religion, and may well use the term when it suits them. But a better understanding of their identity is one which sits within the eclectic bricolage personality of their founding guru. It is through following an orthodoxy based on his life and teachings that they embody and perform not a multi-faith or Hindu form of religion, but a multipraxic form of religion, relational with, but not limited to, Hindu worldviews.